Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of Arihanta Institute to the first ever event in our Voices in Vegan Studies speaker series, a Unifying Vegan Horizon featuring Dr. Jonathan Dickstein. I'll be your MC for the day. My name is Taina Rodriguez Berardi, and I'm on the team here at Arihanta Institute. And for many of you, this may be the first event of ours that you're attending. So I'll briefly say that Arihanta Institute is an IRC 501c3 nonprofit. We're a world-class online institution for learning all about the Jain tradition and how it applies to daily life. We offer certificate courses and a first of its kind master's program in engaged Jain studies with top scholars from around the globe. Our Their areas of expertise are in Jain studies and allied fields of academic inquiry. We're committed to democratizing and making accessible Jain philosophy and traditions in order to educate, empower, and connect individuals worldwide. Our online programs and programming are designed for Jains and non-Jains alike, for people who share a passion for reimagining and co-creating a world where our values and actions converge. Through our efforts, we aim to build a global community dedicated to living in harmony with each other, all beings, and the environment. And that's why we've put this series together. The aim of Voices in Vegan Studies speaker series is twofold: to bring mainstream vegan studies research and ideas to the Jain community and scholars working in Jain studies and engaged Jain studies, but also to expose non-Jains to the many ways Jain philosophy and practice align with veganism, and how Jains connect their veganism to their religious heritage and identity. So to kick off this series and today's conversation, I'd like to introduce one of our core faculty, Professor Jonathan Dickstein. And Dr. Dickstein is an assistant professor of Jain Studies at Arihanta Institute and a visiting assistant professor of religion in Claremont School of Theology. Jonathan specializes in South Asian religions, religion and animals, and comparative ethics. He received his doctoral degree in religious studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and his master's degree in religious studies from the University of Colorado Boulder. Jonathan has published a wide array of interdisciplinary journals such as Religions, Philosophy, East and West, Food Ethics, and Capitalism, Nature, Socialism. And his current work focuses on Jainism and contemporary ecological issues, extending into critical animal studies, food studies, and diaspora studies. He is also the academic lead for the Vegan Studies Initiative here at Arihanta Institute, which he will describe in full shortly. And Jonathan considers himself a scholar practitioner, having spent many years not only in the libraries, but also in public advocating for justice for both humans and non-humans alike. So please, let's give a warm welcome for Dr. Dickstein as he goes into his talk. Welcome.
Great, thank you, Taina. And I'm going to, as I load some slides here, I just wanted to, thank Taina very much for the tireless work and creativity and insight that she brings to Arihanta Institute. She and I have worked together on the Vegan Studies Initiative, including this speaker series, and it's certainly be what it is and what I hope it will be without her. I also want to take a moment to thank our founder and CEO, Parveen Jain, for his tireless leadership in our projects and his ongoing trust and support for this initiative. So today, the title of the talk is Unifying Vegan Horizon. I have myself here in the PowerPoint. You can also hide me individually if you don't want double bobbing head, talking heads throughout the presentation. But I also just want to take this moment to thank you all for being here. I really appreciate you dedicating your time no matter what time zone you're in. And I really hope that the talk will instigate some lively Q&A and discussion after the fact. So most of this session will be about defining veganism and this vegan horizon, as I call it. But I think it's important to situate this in the broader Vegan Studies initiative at Arihanta and in the Voices in Vegan Studies speaker series. So I just ask you for a little time at the outset for this framing. So overall, today's themes are the Vegan Studies initiative at Arihanta, the two basic principles of the Vegan Studies initiative at Arihanta Institute, the Voices in Vegan Studies speaker series, and this veganism of the Unifying Vegan Horizon. So the Vegan Studies Initiative at Arihanta Institute is an online program focused on promoting and enacting veganism as an expression of multi-species nonviolence. The mission is to educate, empower, and connect everyone, Jain and non-Jain, passionate about reimagining and co-creating a world in which our values and actions converge. The initiative is multi-pronged, interweaving first, graduate level academic training with Claremont School of Theology, live and self-paced online learning courses through our own platform, public conferences and guest speaker events, such as this series, and global partnerships with aligned organizations. So the two basic principles of the initiative are first, a shared vegan horizon, and that's going to be the main focus of the talk today. But the second principle is a harmony of values, in particular, the values of nonviolence, ahimsa, and compassion, karuna, toward humans and non-humans, along with an acknowledgement of diverse perspectives on the issues. In Jainism, this is called anekantavada, or non-one-sidedness, a perspectivalism of sorts, including diverse perspectives on the issue of veganism. Now, to give this a little bit more color, the shared vegan horizon in the practice, kind of in the nuts and bolts of the initiative, means that all of our speakers, instructors, and content promote an ideal future in which animals are no longer used or consumed by human communities. And second, this harmony of values includes many, many things. Yet one key aspect is that a world without animal use and consumption does not alone make it a just world. I want to repeat that. It's a world that is this vegan world is not itself a just world. Nonviolence and compassion absolutely includes humans. Thus, the ideal future imagines the absence of colonialism, racism, classism, casteism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, among other forms of intrahuman oppression. Now, as for some of these speakers, we have an entire kind of arsenal of speakers coming out through this year that I'm really excited about, given their diverse backgrounds and specializations, their trainings. I'm kicking off this event. I'm largely an academic and an advocate. Another academic will be following in June, Jain Studies from Pride Institute. Soon thereafter, in July, we have Ed Winters, or AKA Earthling Ed, who's going to join us. And Earthling Ed is maybe one of the most visible figures in mainstream vegan advocacy. And then philosopher Cheryl Abate from UNLV. And then Manisha Deka also has written extensively on animals and the relationship of animal oppression to human oppression. And we have Dr. Pritesh Mutta, who will talk about the kind of health aspects of veganism, and specifically how it relates to both Jain and non-Jain approaches to medicine. Professor Renan LaRue in October from UC Santa Barbara will join us and speak about the history of vegetarianism and veganism in the ancient West, a fascinating topic given how much we tend to associate, somewhat comically so, this kind of Western approach to eating is largely meat-based and Eastern, as it were, is not. Professor Ralu will complicate this issue tremendously. And then Nirva Patel from the Harvard Law School and Policy Program, who's also Jain, talking about their background, but in relation to the work they do policy-wise for animals. And lastly, in December, we will finish the series with Shailene Shah, co-founder of Love and Arms Animal Sanctuary in Erie, Colorado. Okay, so let's come back to this title slide for the second time, and we'll engage in this talk proper. And I say that because if we're going to say that the Vegan Studies Initiative at Arihanta has these two basic principles, and one is a shared vegan horizon, then we need to talk about what vegan means, what horizon means. Well, Arihanta Institute's Vegan Studies Initiative begs the question of what is the meaning of this category vegan that is the object of vegan studies. Vegan studies is not strictly confined to studies about veganism and vegans, however we define those two terms, as related areas such as philosophy, political science, race studies, gender studies, food studies, and environmental studies are absolutely inextricable from a holistic vegan studies. Nevertheless, what vegan and specifically veganism refer to is quite critical if it exists as the hub connecting these various fields. As H.M. Hopeful stated succinctly in his piece Isms, quote, any use of an ism ought to be accompanied by a pause for reflection aimed at clarifying precise character of the referent. End quote. I here attempt to pause, reflect, and clarify the precise character of our ism in question, veganism. In doing so, I do not pursue some pure or original meaning of veganism, but I do resist, quote, the implement or Humpty Dumpty fallacy, the view that words are simply tools to be employed in communication, end quote. In other words, veganism cannot possibly mean whatever an individual speaker wishes it to mean at any moment in time, or at least it cannot mean that if it's going to hold some communicative utility. Now, I must confess that today I fear that I will not present my own perspective clearly enough, or that clarity in its presentation is no match for our enduring, dare I say, stubborn conceptions of veganism. So maybe I can only do my best and see what follows. I expect that what I present will also rub some folks, some vegans, the wrong way. Without spilling the beans too early, I have come to see this common reaction, one that I also had for such a long time, as a result of vegan identitarianism, or the construction of one's core identity around their veganness. More on that to come, but at this point, I simply ask you all to have an open mind and know that I'm not proposing any change in one's values per se, but only how these values are understood in relation to the practice, I shall argue, that is veganism. Now, much of what I will discuss emerged after years of towing some of the now common framings and definitions of veganism. And it was only later that I interrogated them a bit more thoroughly, and to be frank, honestly, that I was willing to re-examine where I had entrenched myself in these kinds of debates about vegans and veganism. Over the past few years, with the assistance of some remarkable collaborators, I've written on this topic, and much of what I present today comes from a food ethics article I published with Jan Dutkiewicz titled "The Ism of Veganism: The Case for a Minimal Practice-Based Definition." This argument, the argument is contained in the title of the piece itself. Veganism indicates a practice, nothing less and nothing more. I'll share the opening paragraph of this article. The Oxford definition of the word veganism is a paragon of brevity and precision, the practice of not eating or using any animal products. This definition involves neither a reason, nor an implied ethics or politics, nor an identification with a broader identity, but hinges on a simple refusal, the not. To be a vegan is simply to be a person who does not eat or use animal products. This is also the common sense understanding of the term, for if someone informs you that they're a vegan, most likely you will assume that they don't consume meat, eggs, or dairy, and probably avoid fur and leather as well. Even People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, arguably the most infamous animal rights organization on the planet, uses this clear and modest definition on its website. Now, to dispel any uncertainty, I want to be clear about two things. So first, the not using any animal products also assumes the not using of animals themselves, that is, the use of animals themselves as products. Second, the argument for veganism as only a practice holds no matter what the category animal products precisely includes and excludes. This latter question of what actions are vegan or not vegan, or what items are vegan or not vegan, are worthy of discussion, but that's not the issue today. And I'm guessing, I'm thinking if I was in the audience myself, if there's already resistance to what I am beginning to suggest. That is, resistance to the suggestion, or even maybe the assumption, that what I'm doing is diluting some real meaning of veganism. I know this feeling very well, for when I became radicalized for animals, I also could not stomach the stomach-centric definitions of veganism. Veganism isn't a diet, I would shout. But what is this real meaning of veganism that is supposedly being diluted? And who is the authority on the matter anyway? Now, I personally would not argue that plausibility or even authority can be traced to origins, but we can still glance back to Donald Watson of the Vegan Society. Watson, who expressed and held many reasons for abstaining from animal products, coined the term veganism in 1944. At the time, it referred to the practice of living upon fruits, nuts, vegetables, grains, and other wholesome non-animal foods. In short, the ism of veganism indicated the action pattern, for a pattern is what turns an action into an ism, of not consuming animal-derived foods. One notable amendment, as indicated in the Oxford definition, is that the practice of living upon non-animal foods now includes living upon non-animal products. In other words, it is a diet that includes all of one's usables and consumables, not only food and drink. But still, veganism remains an indicator of conduct in that definition. But wait, as those who know this history well, that is, of the Vegan Society, you might know that the definition was soon modified. Not long after Watson's introductions of the term vegan and veganism in around 44 and 45, Leslie Cross, another major figure in the Vegan Society, insisted by 1949 that veganism required a more robust and expansive definition. Cross critiqued Watson's dietary conceptualization, asserting that, quote, it would perhaps have been more accurate to have said, not that veganism is, but that it involves living upon non-animal derived foods. Now, this perspective remains today in the philosophy and way of living definition given by the Vegan Society, representing a kind of compromise of sorts. At the time, to bolster his own view, Cross highlighted Watson's announcement in 1945 that, quote, the object of the Vegan Society is to oppose the exploitation of sentient life, end quote. Consequently, as a corrective, Cross suggested that, quote, veganism may therefore be defined as the principle of the emancipation of animals from exploitation by man, end quote. Thus, according to Cross, veganism intrinsically signifies this ethic or philosophy that involves refusing animal products, but veganism is not the refusal itself. I'll address this idea of veganism as a philosophy a bit later, but for now, I have a much more basic, kind of superficial question. Why must the objects or objectives of the vegan society and veganism be one and the same, right? This is what Cross is trying to do, make them the same. But why does the latter, this veganism, require a singular objective or any internal reference to an objective? By way of analogy, we could ask the same question about the objective of vegan studies at Arihanta Institute. Why must the objective of vegan studies match some supposed internal objective of veganism itself? Why can't veganism remain a tool of an objective, a device, a material expression in pursuit of a goal? An interesting move or assumption made by Cross and repeated by many contemporary vegans is the suggestion that it is more accurate, even more real, to conceive the ism of veganism as indicating a belief, thereby operating as a belief-ism, such as Protestantism or humanism or feminism, rather than a practice-ism, like something such as bicyclism. This is why Cross stated that, quote, it would perhaps have been more accurate to have said, not that veganism is, but involves living upon non-animal derived foods. But why is this more accurate? Why is veganism as a practice-ism necessarily lacking? And does veganism as a belief-ism really make any sense? Staunch proponents of veganism as philosophy are not hard to come by in online forums. I know this myself. I was one myself, insisting that veganism is not about doing this or that, buying this or that, or eating this or that, but rather, a la Cross, veganism really refers to a fundamental ethos regarding animals and perhaps also humans. Yet another approach, one oftentimes deployed with the same end of elevating a more real or right veganism, modifies veganism with an adjective of some sort. This refinement apparently signals the motivation for one's practice of veganism, whatever that practice itself might involve. So we have ethical veganism, which often, while not always, is synonymous with the phrase vegan for the animals. There is environmental veganism, which flags broader, yet not necessarily non-anthropocentric motivations for avoiding animal products. There is Gary Francione's abolitionist veganism and Christopher Sebastian McJetter's radical veganism. And intersectional veganism is prevalent in progressive vegan spaces as well. Now, at first, it might seem that these adjectives modifying veganism are simply descriptive of the theoretical basis behind one's veganism. For example, if I say I am an ethical vegan, I seem to be communicating that I abstain from animal products. That is, I live vegan or I am vegan because of my ethical stance regarding non-human animals. Veganism is the act, my animal ethics, such as opposing species discrimination, is the reason. But this is frequently not the case. As one example, Francione refers to his entire theory of abolitionist veganism, otherwise called ethical veganism, as a, quote, profound moral and political commitment to abolition on the individual level, end quote. But is this abolitionist veganism? Or to me, it sounds more like vegan abolitionism. And McJetters describes radical veganism as, quote, supporting intersectional feminism and, quote, being definitely anti-capitalist, end quote. But is it veganism or radicalism that generates these stances on feminism and capitalism? Is this not vegan radicalism rather than radical veganism. Brueck and et al. Have stated that, quote, veganism opposes all oppression and exploitation, and that veganism is basically a social justice movement centered on non-human animals. They continue, we have a problem with a veganism that refuses to embrace consistent anti-oppression and acknowledge the interconnections of oppression, end quote. Yet here, veganism seems to not signal a practice at all, but is rather a social justice movement in and of itself. So taking this wide view, I think Potts and Armstrong summarized this well, if not comprehensively. They have noted that the word vegan has begun to function not only as the descriptors of a practice, a way of living and being in the world, but also a critical term. In this regard, we can say that vegan refers to a particular kind of ethical and political commitment to uncover and reject the ideologies that justify and enable the consumption of non-human animals, end quote. Now, I absolutely do not support the oppression of humans or non-humans. This should be obvious. And I understand that there is a need to foreground animals in definitions, or at least I understand the move to foreground animals in definitions of veganism, as it derives from the legitimate need for non-human animals to be centered in a movement of their own. I also recognize that the impetus to expand the definition of veganism beyond animals and to include humans is often a response to a long history of single issue and animals only vegan and animal rights campaigns that have routinely ignored or discounted the entangled plights of humans under animal exploitative systems. However, my sole critique is that in order to accomplish these two vital tasks, that is, one, to center animals in their own movement, and two, to highlight the entangled plights of humans and animals, advocates have demanded that veganism itself do work it really can't do, repeatedly pushing a square into a circular hole. This tendency remains confusing to this day, and it is unnecessary. And I would also argue that it's obstructive, given how far our vocabulary for multi-species justice has evolved since the 1940s. Now, since the 1970s, first through the work of Richard Ryder and then with Peter Singer, speciesism emerged to describe the specific form of unjust vision and treatment faced by non-human animals, akin to racism, sexism, and other isms describing specific, but by no means unentangled, by no means not overlapping forms of oppression. Speciesism centers the oppression and exploitation of non-humans. Speciesism as a term is not perfect, and what term is perfect, but it does provide a means to update our understanding of veganism and our language pertaining to it. It gives us an opportunity to give a beliefism that works complementarily to the practice of veganism. Now, moreover, extremely broad definitions such as a profound moral and political commitment to abolition or a stance against all exploitation sound much more like a commitment to justice writ large, even morality in toto, or in a more political valence, total liberation, as David Pellow argues, and I would also follow. We also see this in understandings of veganism as a stance to reduce suffering or a stance to uphold the rights of humans and non-humans, in which case the term veganism seems to operate like consequentialism or utilitarianism or deontology or rights theory. It seems to be operating redundantly with terms that already exist. The upshot here is that in 1944, And then in 1949 as well, phrases such as speciesism and anti-speciesism, animal liberation, total liberation, intersectionality, and so on simply didn't exist. So it's understandable why veganism stood out as the appropriate candidate for signifying the philosophy behind the practice of abstaining from animal use and consumption and the use and consumption of animal products. But the word fails to satisfactorily to perform this double duty, which is one reason why the vocabulary itself emerged and has become more prevalent. If one concedes that veganism cannot satisfy as both a belief-ism and a practice-ism, they may opt for the former and simply insist that veganism is a belief. But this is going to run, if I've not made this clear already, into two troubles. The first is the aforementioned problem of defining veganism in any way that does not simply repeat extant and, in my view, much more suitable terms, such as anti-speciesism and so on. The second trouble is that if one wishes to jettison the practice focus for the belief focus, then they are now open to individuals eating and acting and consuming in almost any way they choose, yet still referring to themselves as following veganism, because no matter their behavior, they still proclaim adherence to some belief, some vegan philosophy. I personally fail to locate the cogency or utility in this approach, and we simply don't have to follow it. With other words, we can refine our frameworks. We learn and adapt. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. Now, let me be clear that I do not find anything at all wrong with expressing one's rationale for their veganism. I actually staunchly encourage it. Do you abstain from animal use and consumption because of a commitment to animal liberation? Wear it proudly. Is your veganism motivated by a rejection of racial capitalism? Wear it loud. Peterson and Stanetsky write, for example, quote, "We are vegan because we are ethically opposed to the notion that life, human or otherwise, can or should ever be rendered as a viable or sellable quality." I agree. Yet note how these authors are not asserting that someone is vegan only if they likewise oppose the commodification of life, nor do they suggest that this stance of opposition defines veganism itself, but rather they are stating that it is their reason for refusing animal consumption. In short, it is not veganism that requires an ethical opposition to the commodification of life, but rather the ethical opposition to the commodification of life requires veganism as a practice. So I will conclude on 2 points. The first is a speculation on one aspect of resistance to the practice-based definition of veganism. The second is how, if we accept the practice-based definition, we can understand a unifying vegan horizon that does not require any dilution or sacrifice of values. Now, admittedly, my lack of time today and a lack of expertise in psychology limits comprehensive conclusions about why veganism is routinely criticized as a value adaptive practice and concretized as an identity constitutive belief. Now, when I say routinely criticized, I actually mean within vegan communities themselves, within animal rights, animal liberation communities themselves. I think when you step outside of these communities, as we began this discussion, and express that you're vegan to someone, they typically think it's a practice. I myself was asked the other day, oh, are you vegan? And I said yes. And their first question was, why? right? To me, this very much illuminated how that is the commonplace understanding of the term. And yet inside vegan communities and animal rights communities, there is this internal criticism and insistence on what I sometimes refer to as big veganism. Now, if you ask me why, if I had to answer, I probably would suggest some combination of the deep relationships between food and identity, belief and identity, and value-driven habits and identity. I won't discuss it today, but I really do think that this notion that people are not vegan because they like the taste or the price and the accessibility only misses the mark. As I believe Aaron Gross once said, we come into the world eating. It's one of the first things we do and always do. Eating is so much a part of our identity. And we are also kind of build our identity around beliefs and also around our habits. And as a result, definitions of veganism that lack indicators of our beliefs and of our values, right? The values that sometimes translate into habits, comes across as watered down. So I think this is kind of the first kind of vegan identitarianism, the move to that. I think it certainly has to do with that, these aspects. But related and not entirely the same, I do sense an enduring anxiety of association that seems to plague the case for a practice-based definition. So anxiety of association, or what we might call guilt by association. There resounds an instinctual hesitancy to share one's identity with those who have dissimilar ideological and practical leanings from oneself, and an outright aversion to those who profess conflicting ones. For example, fierce debates over whether one can simultaneously be vegan and racist or vegan and sexist abound in online spaces and personal interactions. Now, for the anti-racists, the stakes seem high, as the thought of being collectivized and associated with racists in any way is extremely disturbing, both on a superficial level, which is understandable, and also given the investment they've put into both their vegan identities and their anti-racist identities. In other words, many feel that the big tent of veganism as only a practice is simply too big, welcoming too many others with whom they would rather not associate, and therefore whom they would rather not associate with veganism. Once again, is that the notion of veganism as a practice seems to welcome too many others with whom some vegans would rather not associate, and hence they resist letting those individuals be associated with veganism, their veganism. But there's a few questions we can ask. Don't racists also drive electric cars, vote for left-leaning political parties, and boycott Monsanto? If an anti-racist does the same, does that really associate them with racists in any meaningful way? Sharing an action pattern with a racist is unthreatening to one's self-identification when it is understood as only that, an action pattern. But once veganism is internalized as an ethos and synonymized or tightly knit with total liberationism or everything morally good, then the concern seems warranted. Ironically, even Francione corroborates the point. Quote, we think it is unhelpful to say, for example, that a person who is sexist is not a vegan. A person who is sexist is not an abolitionist, as we use that term, but a sexist can be a sexist vegan. There is a tendency on the part of some vegans to use the term so broadly that it becomes shorthand for all of the elements of that person's view or of ideal morality. This simply causes confusion. While I disagree with Francione in other ways, here I agree and also push it further. Vegan does not clarify anything about one's view of ideal morality. It only expresses what one does, not why. Sexist vegans exist, racist vegans exist. So too do former vegans and those who are mostly vegan. Admitting these facts does not make one aligned philosophically, ethically, or politically with sexism, racism, or a less than vegan horizon. Moreover, is it vegan does not answer all of our questions regarding ethical use and consumption. For while, technically speaking, palm oil and non-fair trade chocolate are not animal products themselves and are therefore technically vegan, them being vegan does not fully answer the question of the ethicality of purchasing them or engaging or not engaging in a host of other activities. In short, the larger question is not, is it vegan, but rather, is it right? This bleeds into my second point, my second concluding point. At the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that the Vegan Studies Initiative is guided by two principles, a shared vegan horizon and a harmony of values. The vegan horizon means that all speakers, instructors, and content promote an ideal future in which animals are no longer used or consumed by human communities. The first principle does not express why we promote that future or how we get to that future, or what else that future looks like in terms of justice for animals and humans. It simply charts the course for an animal input-free society. As such, this shared vegan horizon does not promote better or humane animal farming, regenerative agriculture, or any reducitarianisms or flexitarianisms that lack veganism as their ultimate horizon point. However, it does include space for listening to a diversity of views on how to get there, what will work and not work best, what is most urgent, and what may be potential hindrances and pitfalls. This speaker series itself exemplifies a shared horizon, but with potentially differing views on the details of its accomplishment. And don't forget that a philosophically adaptive and means adaptive vegan horizon is not the only principle of this initiative. It's the what, but not the why. The second principle, the harmony of values, provides the why. For Jains, the why, the value, is the commitment to nonviolence and compassion to all sentient organisms. This why explains Jain vegetarianism and increasingly Jain veganism. It also explains that while sexist vegans exist and racist vegans exist, sexism and racism and other discriminatory isms are not tolerated in the Vegan Studies Initiative and not ought to be tolerated by anyone dedicated to liberation for all, or in more dharmic terminology, total ahimsa, total nonviolence. This past November, I interviewed Love in Arms Animal Sanctuary co-founder Shaleen Shah, a Jain from Gujarat. And he expressed this point, I think unknowingly, but did so very well. Quote, you get to veganism and you realize this isn't the end goal. You realize there is something beyond that is driving this entire path. And that is ahimsa. That is the overarching reason for veganism. The harmony of values refers to how we will not all engage with nonviolence or some other value in exactly the same sense. After all, we are not all Jains, myself included. And here we can interpret ahimsa, nonviolence, in a much more universal, basic, and user-friendly sense. Nonviolence as a vow to refrain from causing others to suffer and die as much as we are able, because their suffering matters, no matter their race, class, caste, gender, ability, or species. And on the flip side, there is a vow to promote their thriving, because so too does their safety and joy matter, no matter their race, class, caste, gender, ability, or species. So in conclusion, and to correct myself, I stress that the Unifying Vegan Horizon is not the horizon point, but one horizon point. It is but one standard for human behavior in a just future world. We may debate and disagree about the ways to get there, and this disagreement is itself aligned with the Jain spirit of listening to and considering multiple perspectives. And I'm sure there are speakers in this series and individuals in this audience and individuals who will watch this later on who will not agree about everything I've said. But still, we are in the same boat, seeking the same shore. It's the root that we squabble about. And the unifying vegan vision is hollow without this harmony of values, values that are not veganism itself, but are what drive veganism, what use veganism to achieve its ends. Veganism is one tool, education is another, and so is advocacy, and so is direct intervention. As the canonical Tadvarta Sutra, a very famous and old Jain text, famously exclaims, Paras paro pagraho jivanam. All living beings are bound together. Our lives are inextricably interwoven with those of others. Veganism is one practice that expresses our care for all feeling beings, human and non-human, near and far, today and tomorrow. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dickstein, for this very well-researched and explanative talk. We do have some questions in the Q&A that I'd love to address as we get into that portion of our event. A couple of them are actually, our first one is from Prakash Sanchiti, which may be a question that we'll speak to in future Voices in Vegan Studies sessions. But they ask of the role of veganism on immunology and the point of views there, therefore, on that, and asking for examples. So I know we do have in September, we have Dr. Pritesh Mutta. He's a physician and professor at UT Health Houston that may be speaking to some of these health perspectives. But Jonathan, if you have a point on that to provide.
Well, I typically refer, to specific health concerns and issues to experts. And so we will have people like Dr. Mutta come in and speak. However, I think an interesting point to realize, and maybe this is not answering the question, but is related, is that because of how used to we are to thinking of animals as food and using animals as food, that when we talk about veganism, we immediately go to health concerns for us. And I think it's absolutely essential to discuss health concerns. But I think before we get to that, the question is about animals, as I like to say, before they were food. Once we have decided, say, hypothetically, that it is acceptable to use animals in a certain way and products from animals, then maybe we talk about in what ways and what they're good or bad for. But I think we start from, well, what is either the Jain vision or a non-Jain vision for using animals at all? And secondly, I think that there's a way that we also have this ingrained anthropocentrism where we tend to think that human life needs to be optimized. And once we're kind of optimized in some way, then we'll have time to talk about animals. This isn't what the question is asking, but I think this is this way, like, I started to live a certain way and my health went down or this and that. And I'm not making any claims about anyone's particular health issues, but there is this assumption, John Rawls used to refer to it as a lexical priority, this kind of idea that it's almost like human welfare lives in some categorical higher realm than animals. And that we tend to think that we need to prioritize human interests. And once they're satisfied, then we'll get to animals. I'm not saying that there's a kind of a radical egalitarianism between all humans and all non-humans, but it is interesting how that move is often our first move. Anyway, to answer the question, I would love, and I'm waiting for Dr. Mutta to join our series, and I can't wait to hear what he has to say.
Thank you for bringing that context in, and it allows us to even remind people that this is the series. We do have many wonderful, really uh, just topical speakers that touch on veganism and bring in many other aspects of the conversation. So if you go, I dropped in the chat and I'll do it again, but please check out some of our future events. Um, to continue with the Q&A, we have a question from Anthony Gasillo. How do we help others see the value and commit to the change pertinent to avoiding animal abuse without demanding or resorting to the violence of showing them animal slaughter videos?
Mm. This is a wonderful question. Thank you so much, Anthony, because I've been at so many different on sides of this as an educator, as an advocate. I've been the one showing videos, kind of saying, if you participate in this, you should be able to watch the videos and kind of showing what's actually happening, because it's just, if you study South Asian religions and you read about kind of these hell realms in Buddhism, Jainism, and so on, I feel like they sometimes don't hold a candle to industrial animal agriculture. But it is so jarring and so brutal that we might not want to use it, or use it very selectively. So, I think that there are amazing texts out there that are just as vivid. I mean, Singer's Animal Liberation came out, and his descriptions of slaughterhouses and laboratories were jarring for most. I think text is a way in which you can give warnings for individuals about what they're engaging with, and they can put it down at their own pace. They can read and maybe take a break. I often have my students read Timothy Patrat's every 12 seconds. It's a startling text. It's jarring, but it's a text, and you can kind of work with it slowly. I'll add to that I think I thought for a long time that what was needed was confrontation. Really need to like bring the issue to the fore, show people what they're doing, and then there's a sense of like guilt and shaming almost involved, even if unintentionally. But the problem is social science shows us that guilt and shame don't really work, or shame doesn't really work to ask for change. Hardly ever is someone going to walk away from being told they're a terrible person and they do awful things and then make the change. So I think there's a way in which one can begin with listening, understanding, respect where someone's coming from, and then start to describe how, look, their values, we might share the same values. This is what kind of I've discussed a little bit. We share the same values, but we've been taught not to direct our ethical gaze in this direction. And I know it's hard. I know how much our consumption habits are tied with our ancestry, with our culture, with our religions, with our families, our own self, individual identity. But we're not the perpetrators here. We're in many ways the victims. I don't mean akin to animals. I mean the victims of conditioning and the victims of propaganda. And so I think while it's very hard because it's so awful what's happening to animals, and the situation is so urgent and so dire, but if we're really committed to working for the alleviation of the suffering of animals, then that maturity is required on our part, in my opinion.
Thank you for bringing that nuance to the conversation and um, answering the question in such a way that it allows us to or reminds us about ahimsa at its core, and nonviolence, and bringing that to the forefront, especially within the systems that we're participating in on a wider scale. I appreciate that. We have a question from one of our future speakers, Cheryl Abate, and I apologize if that was not the correct pronunciation of your name. They ask, do you think that we can act violently and uncompassionately towards non-sentient animals?
Mm. This is a wonderful question, and thank you, Cheryl, and really also can't wait for Cheryl's talk. Just I hope they don't mind me saying I know Cheryl from, I don't know, 2012, 13, back in Boulder, Colorado. It's like wonderful reconnecting for the series after all these years. But to answer the question, I think so from the Jain tradition, from the perspective of the ahimsa is something that can happen in action, in speech, and in mind. So there could be a way in which one is, in a sense, committing ahimsa through the passions, the kashayas, these kind of passions, even towards maybe non-sentient organisms, if it's a kind of violent mental state. Personally, I would find it kind of challenging to understand the notions of harm to non-sentient organisms. If I'm going to kind of try to toggle kind of South Asian and Western ideas, or this notion of dukkha, suffering or unpleasantness, it seems if the concern for ahimsa is about the suffering or unpleasantness in the world, then it would be odd to direct that gaze towards entities that lack an ability to experience dukkha, and conversely sukha, pleasure, or pleasantness. That's going to open up a really interesting conversation, as it already has when we start talking about plants, right? I talk about this in many of my courses about Jains fully accept the sentience of plants. We could look at, say, contemporary Western science that will largely not accept that. There has been this recent declaration, right? The kind of declaration on insect consciousness. So we have all these other liminal kind of creatures that we're still deciding whether they can feel pain or not, or how much that matters or not. And so I find it to be very rich, I feel, to think about. But anyway, to return to the question, I find it a little challenging to talk about violence towards, in the strict sense, towards insentient organisms, especially if we look at it, I'll just say from a Jain perspective, that ties violence to dukkha and sometimes to this notion of prana or vitality. And so if we're kind of talking about entities that lack these, then it's challenging to understand acting towards them as being violent, unless we're also attributing mental states as being violent. Anyway, complicated question. I'd really like to discuss that kind of at a snail's pace and in more detail some other time.
Thank you so much for answering that. And Cheryl's talk is on July 15th, titled New Ethical Issues in Contemporary Veganism. So that is something to look forward to as well. And we have a few more questions. I think one that I'll go to is from David Kiloran. I'm curious about your view of the relation between veganism and religions generally. You seem to think that Jainism and veganism are especially consonant with each other, and that seems plausible. What do you think about other religions? I'd be interested in your opinion about religions that have a prominent commitment to nonviolence, i.e., or example, Quakerism, as well as religions where such a commitment is either absent or minimized.
Also a very good and deep question. It also kind of begs the additional question of what we talk about when we mean religion versus, say, culture or community. How pervasive are the values within those communities? But I think that, yes, Jainism is an easy match for the long history of lacto-vegetarianism. So for those not familiar in the audience, Jains are the original vegetarians for the enduring vegetarian community for thousands of years, and lacto-vegetarian, so also non-consumption of eggs or honey. So it's really dairy that is something of a last frontier, you could say, for younger or vegan Jains looking to add that in to the Jain diet and Jain way of life. I think other traditions, such as Quakers and really Abrahamic traditions, indigenous traditions are going to have, especially North American indigenous traditions, kind of a whole different area. But I will say that I think that with this kind of golden rule, it's like pervasive golden rule mentality, the question is, can we apply that multi-species? And if we haven't, why so, right? So if we're operating with a religion that, say, A, has a kind of divine command theory or a dominionism that presents humans as being superior to non-humans in some unreflective way and some kind of almost absolute way, then it's the nonviolence might not do any work because we're really just talking about intra-human nonviolence. But it's not only Abrahamic traditions. I study Vedic traditions as well, ancient Indian traditions, and I often highlight how just like in Genesis, Adam is already naming animals for what they are and how they will kind of operate in the world. At the moment of the origin of the universe in a Vedic context, there's already the kind of at the moment of creation is the existence of domesticated animals. So I often say that domestication is prefigured in the ancient Indian context, which means that it still isn't a bit anthropocentric. And I think this comes up in Jain dialogues about dairy and cows. It is still very hard to shake the notion that cows' very reason for being, their dharma, like the reason they're here is to have some kind of use value for humans. So I think even in Jainism, there's a challenge. I will say what I find, and I'll kind of end on this point for this question is, I was listening to two individuals or reading to individuals from completely different traditions. Margaret Robinson, who's talking about indigenous traditions in the Americas, and Matthew Scully's book, Dominion, from a Christian context. And there's a sense in which, and I find this to be as close to a universal theme as I've come across in religious studies, is that our kind of mytho-histories of the origin of the world, our relationships to animals, and oftentimes sacrificing and consuming them, includes a narrative of consent. It's also as if, like, at some earlier time, some grandfather bear or salmon or cow made some kind of pact with some early human being to provide for them or to offer themselves. Right? Think about the discourse of cows that give milk as if it's their giving that's actually happening, right? I think it is very hard to not find this narrative of consent. But I'm just paraphrasing what Margaret Robinson said at one point because it stuck with me, is she said, well, this pact was made at a certain time in which these individuals felt a dire necessity. And according to the mythology, the kind of salmon made a pact based on the circumstances at hand. Given the scarcity, given the challenge, I will contract into this relationship with you. But as Matthew Scully, writes in his book, he says, what happens when a necessary evil is no longer necessary? Is it not just evil? So here's the question. What happens if we're in a situation now in which the contract would not be made by those animals, right? And this is all in the realm of a kind of an internal mythology or history of a tradition. But I think that the more that individuals within their traditions actually look back at the basis for the sacrifice and consumption of animals and the conditions under which they were permitted, then it's going to be hard to square that with the conditions that we contemporarily live under, or many of us, right? I'm not going to make the universal claim that it's all of us. But those of us who are going to the supermarket and live in either abundance or relative abundance, at least compared to thousands of years ago, I think it would be hard for a lot of traditions to do a very honest self-reflection and not see how some modification is warranted. Thank you. It's a great question again.
Yes, appreciate everyone who's been adding questions to the Q&A, and Jonathan for taking them all on live and in person. We do have another in-depth question from Dr. Kojen Bohanec, who is also a professor at Arihanta Institute. And they ask, it seems that the thesis of this talk is veganism indicates a practice, nothing less or nothing more. Is there a real, in quotes, meaning definition of veganism? Am I to understand that is what you are attempting to define? Is this reductive? Veganism certainly can be more than this too. Is there a hegemony in attempting to define veganism for all vegans? Can we not simply accept a true definition of veganism as being pluralistic? That is, like religion, where a religion is what religious people say it is. Likewise, veganism is what vegans say it is.
Yeah, also a very challenging question.
Mhm.
So I find, well, two things. First, I find that because veganism is very much tied as a, um, it has a goal. I mean, I'm not going to say they're proselytizing, but I'm going to say there's a goal with veganism to actually affect some kind of change. So it needs some practical utility. So I think that on the practical level, this notion that you are talking about veganism as getting people to adopt a certain kind of practice, an action pattern, is very simple and it's very understandable. It reminds me of years ago, I remember talking to like a few undergraduates at UCSB, and I said, in my mind, I said, don't confuse animal advocacy and vegan advocacy. They're not necessarily one and the same thing. If there are people who are just trying to convert people to change their action pattern, that's a different kind of advocacy, say, than when one is involved in talking about animal ethics or speciesism. Now, can some vegan outreach marshal these ethics to make their case? Sure, but I don't find them to be the same thing. And I think my question, or like for Cogent or anyone else, is why are we so like white knuckled to it? Why are we so white knuckled to veganism means this? Because it doesn't require a loss. And I think that I think the individuals from 80 years ago did a wonderful job with the tools on hand. But we now have different language. We can talk about speciesism, we can talk about animalisms, sentientism. We have all this different vocabulary. And I think what it does, I mean, there's other aspects of this that I didn't get into, but veganism, even if its name seems to foreground vegans, right? It seems to be about vegans. And a lot of the vitriol and stigmatization, say, of veganism is because it seems to be about vegans. Anyone who is vegan has known this when someone who is, say, consuming animal products in their presence apologizes to them. Like, I'm really sorry that I'm doing this, right? It's almost as if the veganism is about the person and not about, say, the animals, or say industrial slaughterhouses and exploited labor, or kind of exploited farm work, or whatever else we're talking about. And so I guess that's the question. Yes, of course. I mean, if we want to say that it can be defined however vegans define it, I just don't see any superior coherence, and I certainly don't find utility. I mean, I'm open to rethinking that, but after years of maybe thinking about it too much, I think this is where I am now.
Thank you for that. And we actually have another question from the community that is tangentially related. It asks, there is often much infighting in the vegan and animal advocacy world over how veganism and animal advocacy should be undertaken and defined. And based on everything you've presented here, how do you think a notion of a unifying vegan horizon can help address this infighting?
Hmm. I mean, groups love to infight, especially left groups, radical groups. It's like what we're best at. And there also seems to be a way, I think what's telling about this is that not many people, and even myself included, are not experts in social science, or experts in social movements, or experts in movement strategy. So I think if we were equipped with those tools, we could understand a lot of the infighting. And I think a lot of more mature, say, vegan advocacy now is discussing this. Like I said, I would love to present facts to people and them change immediately. I would love to present an ethical argument and then say, Jonathan, you're actually absolutely right. I will change my entire life and worldview, and I will talk to everybody I know using the exact tools that you've used, and it will work on them exactly the same. The challenge is like, that's just not how human beings operate, whether we like it or not. Some people say like science doesn't care. Like science doesn't care. We joke a lot in Jainism, like karma doesn't care. Kind of it has its own thing. And it's like, yeah, like human psychology doesn't care really about what you would like to be the case in order to change. So I guess that's my question. I think if we could learn from social science, then we could reduce a lot of the kind of tactic infighting. But I think there's also what I mentioned in my talk. I think that there is this absolute resistance to be associated. So associated with people whose values or ideas either differ from yours or conflict with yours. And hence you want to kind of throw them out of the tent completely. Because we've assumed that to say that I'm vegan means something kind of absolutely core about me, fundamental about me. So I don't want to be associated with people who I differ with, but are also vegan. So I say they're not really vegan, right? I engage in what sounds like about a purity politic. That's just really about me and who I'm associated with. But I find that we hardly ever do this thing. A great example, just to maybe wrap this up, is there's a group in there's two young Jain groups, Jain vegans and vegan Jains. And I often kind of think it's kind of funny. It's like, wait, is it Jain vegan? Are you vegans who happen to be Jain, or are you Jains who happen to be vegan? Right. And I think it's the case. I mean, this is just per kind of, obviously you can't have two groups with the same website, but I think the idea is that you're a vegan Jain in many ways. You're a vegan Christian, and there's non-vegan Christians, non-vegan Jains. And whether or not we want to engage in really dense identity construction at all, kind of say what's really a Jain or what's really a Christian, I don't find that to be very useful. But I think we could reduce the infighting the more we kind of walk away from trying to protect some kind of core identity. And if you study South Asian religions traditions, you'll probably realize that core identity is a myth anyway. So, and fabrication. So you want to take some other courses at Arihanta, it might help even with some maturity when it comes to infighting and advocacy.
Definitely. I think I was going to ask you to, because everything that you're discussing um, will have its place in conversation in an upcoming course that you and Dr. Christopher Miller are putting together for the Vegan Studies initiative at Arihanta Institute. And I was going to drop a link in the chat. Maybe you can just, while I do that, just give a quick overview, and then we have a final couple questions.
Yes, Professor Christopher Miller, who is instrumental in so much of what we do at Arihanta, and I are teaching a course on Jainism, veganism, and engaged religion, which actually has quite a bit to do, at least my components, with what I've been speaking of, about the kind of questions religion's trying to answer, why we engage with religion, and in a way, how veganism is kind of similar to that. But also it just mostly deals with the way in which Jainism as a religious tradition or as a philosophy is very much concerned with the problem of suffering, not only for one's karma and one's rebirth, but also because, to sound trite, suffering is bad, intrinsically bad in Jainism. And we really should try to avoid it as much as possible. So this is kind of what I said earlier, a vow to kind of refrain from causing suffering and death as much as possible. Jains have been committed to this for millennia. And in the course, Chris and I talk about all the reasons and all the ways that Jains have adopted this in the world, enacted this in the world, and how there is, in the past decade, if not more, a move to addressing kind of new opportunities to live this value. And for Jains, it's very much has to do with dairy consumption. And we don't have time to talk about kind of the extremely complicated status and operation of the dairy industry in India, how that affects Jains in the diaspora, but it is a very, very complicated but necessary topic to engage with.
Great. Thank you for humoring me on that. I did drop a link to this upcoming live course, Jainism, Veganism, and Engage Religion in our group chat. And speaking to some of the topics that you just mentioned and the lived experience, right, as we all engage these practices and traditions, one of our MA in Engaged Jain Studies students, Chaitanya Prakash, has asked a question. How are we going to sensitize our medical doctors and nutritionists about the importance of veganism? Most of the medical practitioners are telling people for that to get protein, one should eat meat.
Mm. Yes, it's a little frustrating, right? Because for so many years now, if not decades, major dietetic and medical organizations have publicly stated the viability of an all plant-based food diet for human beings at all stages of life. What I am not saying is that there are not certain medical conditions that might complicate the issue. What I'm not saying is that there are not issues of accessibility and discrimination and uh, and price that also impact this decision. I'm certainly not implying that it's some kind of instant universal shift that is neglectful of the differences of human being situations. But it is challenging, right? And it's just maybe a generational, I mean, I don't have the answer to this, but maybe it really is just generational, where we have more and more medical students being following the trends, right? Just as law follows culture, so too will medicine follow culture in many ways. And you have more and more patients that come saying that I live plant-based diet. I know it's possible. I know it's healthy. I could use some assistance. And so doctors will have to become more and more capable of fielding patients such as this. I think overall, I think Chaitanya, I think is in Chennai, and I think a lot of medicine in India very rarely so deals with nutrition, what you intake, what you take in. Like Ayurvedic medicine is very much concerned with this. And I find that that's a great kind of model to lead from. Unfortunately, in the United States, most of our doctors have very little background, at least historically, in nutrition. And they're really just treating symptoms. They're really just helping you get out of the kind of immediate pain or immediate problem. So I would hope that there's a dual shift. One is that medical practitioners just have to field more patients on plant-based diets. And that second, we just start addressing what's coming in first, preventative medicine as it is. Not to mention holistic medicine when it comes to mental health, emotional health, and so on. But preventative medicine would be wonderful.
Yes, absolutely. I think looking at things holistically, especially here in the United States, where actually our next question speaks to specifically the question of how many vegans are there in the United States.
Mhm.
And I believe it's asking what the benefits of veganism are or is. And
I
that's
think
from
we're
Surendra Singhvi. Sorry.
I think we're hovering around, I mean, as far as reporting goes, 1%, 2% that is kind of identifying as vegan. I don't know the accuracy of, that self-reporting. But also, this isn't really the question, but I tend to find it, I guess not as useful for me to know how many people are. I mean, I don't even know what the identification is. Is it what they're eating and what they're not eating? Is it perfect veganism, not perfect veganism? It's very hard to say what the value in that is. I think a very interesting question sometimes is how many people who are living vegan in some way are advocating, are speaking, are actually involved in movement creation. You know, it's hard to say. I mean, if I could talk to one person and maybe help them move towards a vegan lifestyle, but actually activate or radicalize them for animals, I feel like that's a much greater impact than, say, getting 3 people to give up some food product. So, I mean, I find it interesting. I don't know, current data on that. I think these numbers are always growing, and we also have just like a massive animal product industry with immense connections and funds on the opposite side of that movement. So.
Thank you for answering that. And we've reached our, I believe we've answered all of our questions from the Q&A section. Jonathan, if there's any final words that you'd like to give to our community and to anyone who will be watching this in the future on our channels, please do so now.
I think I just would like to end on the notion is that there might be this hyper fixation on veganism that I don't know how helpful it's been in recent memory on like defining it, making sure that my individual life is absolutely vegan in every possible way. Not only because we are implicated in fossil fuels, we are implicated in exploited labor when it comes to plant-based foods, but also because what about all of the other issues that might not have to relate to veganism per se, but have to do with justice, whether at the local level, whether it has to do at a global level. So I think a focus on the behind the curtain, right? The motivations. We're talking about speciesism, we're talking about total liberation, we're talking about ahimsa. That's where I tend to direct the spotlight. And the more that we understand those ideas and commit to them, the veganism easily follows. That being said, and maybe I shouldn't need to say it, is that we're always willing to adjust our worldview if our habits already kind of align with that worldview. So there is value in helping people already align their practices with the ethic you're also trying to communicate. These are not mutually exclusive. We can kind of walk and chew gum at the same time on that one. But I do acknowledge that as human beings, we also tend to find ourselves more open to ideas when our actions are already in relative alignment with them. I want to say thank you, Taina, so much. I really appreciate everything you do, and it's been a pleasure being here with you today.
Thank you so much. Your talk was enlightening, and you even got some kudos from Kelly over at Love and Arms Annual Sanctuary, who I know you do research and partnership with. So thank you all for attending. We appreciate your support. Please do head over to the Voices in Vegan Studies Speaker Series website to learn more about our future events and to sign up and to learn more about what we do at Arihanta Institute. Thank you again, and we will see you in the future. Take care. Jai Jinendra.